When we picture the ultimate end-of-history clash led by a figure like Almaty, our minds usually drift toward the cinematic. We imagine vast, sweeping desert plains, thousands of charging cavalry, and the flash of drawn swords under a burning sun. But military strategists analyzing contemporary conflicts see a very different landscape. The modern battlefield has shifted away from open terrain. Tomorrow's conflicts will be fought inside the suffocating, complex geometry of contested megacities. In these urban centers, conventional armies arrive with an overwhelming billion-dollar advantage. They bring mechanized infantry, heavy armor, and a relentless web of digital surveillance. Drones loiter overhead, capturing high-resolution thermal imaging and signals intelligence, mapping every movement on the ground in real time. So how does a lightly armed, heavily outnumbered resistance force survive against an opponent that controls the airspace, the armor, and the airwaves? How do they actually win? They use asymmetric guerrilla warfare operations. Instead of matching force with force, they treat the enemy's massive size and rigid structure as a vulnerability. Thousands of small, independent units continuously chip away at the invading force from the inside, exhausting resources and turning the city into a weapon. We have empirical data on exactly how this works. In 1994, the Russian military rolled deep into Grozny, Chechnya, expecting a swift victory. Instead, small teams of local fighters, armed with light weapons, systematically dismantled entire armored brigades among the ruined apartment blocks. The Chechens mastered the use of the urban canyon. They allowed long columns of Russian T-72 tanks to drive deep into narrow city streets. Then they destroyed the first and last vehicles in the line. The entire convoy was instantly trapped, unable to move forward or retreat. Conventional tanks are designed for open plains. Their main guns can't aim high enough to reach the upper floors of high-rise buildings. Taking advantage of this, hunter-killer teams fired rocket-propelled grenades down into the thin, vulnerable roof armor of the Russian vehicles. This mechanical reliance on hierarchy and doctrine creates a specific vulnerability. Conventional units function efficiently as long as they follow the script, but when that script is torn up by a 360-degree threat, the rigid structure tends to paralyze. Decision paralysis sets in as the battalion's centralized control struggles to adapt to the chaos. By memorizing the geometry of the city and adapting on the fly, a decentralized group of locals can negate the heavy firepower of a modern military. Surviving the initial assault is one challenge. Surviving a prolonged siege is another. Defenders face constant resource constraints, struggling to secure food, medicine, and ammunition while the enemy attempts to starve them out. To keep fighting, insurgents build adaptive hybrid supply chains. They bypass blockades using hidden subterranean tunnels. They rely on local bartering networks and civilian support to distribute critical supplies without needing a central, easily targeted warehouse. But starvation isn't the only threat during a siege. Modern militaries possess sophisticated electronic warfare tools. If a resistance commander uses a radio or a satellite phone, algorithms can geolocate that signal in seconds and direct a precision strike to the exact coordinates. The solution is to go entirely dark. Insurgents employ decentralized peer-to-peer communication networks. By deliberately abandoning modern electronics, they completely blind the billion-dollar digital surveillance grid hovering above them. This network runs on purely analog methods. Orders are passed through folding paper notes carried by couriers on bicycles. Critical intelligence spreads via word of mouth in the ambient noise of a crowded market, making it completely invisible to satellite intercepts. In a contested megacity, survival depends on constant fragmentation. Spreading resources thin and keeping communications invisible ensures there is no single logistical hub for the enemy to target. While crippling supply lines and disabling tanks is necessary, the ultimate target in this kind of conflict isn't physical hardware. The most vulnerable component of any invading force is the human brain operating the machinery. Through psychological warfare and information control, insurgents actively target the enemy's will to fight. They use localized hit-and-run tactics, carefully placed rumors, and manipulated media to sow doubt. The goal is to make the occupying soldiers feel entirely isolated from their command structure. For the conventional soldier, the city becomes a labyrinth of chronic paranoia. Every window is a potential sniper position. Every pile of rubble could hide an explosive. Because the enemy perfectly blends in with the civilian population, the soldier faces a constant, unseen threat that slowly erodes their mental stability. The resistance forces, however, operate with a radically different mindset. Rooted in deep theological perspectives, they view the brutal conditions of the besieged city not as a mechanical failure, but as a necessary spiritual test. This gives them a reservoir of collective resilience that outlasts the material logic of the invading army. An occupying force can have infinite ammunition and total air superiority, but the campaign ends the exact moment its troops simply refuse to go down the next alley. Guerrilla leaders view these grueling urban tactics as long-term instruments of a sequential narrative of grand strategy. The resistance does not intend to destroy the empire's military in a single battle. Instead, they force the superpower to endlessly bleed trillions of dollars trying to police an ungovernable space, driving the occupying nation toward financial collapse and political fatigue at home. Guerrilla strategists prioritize the metrics of institutional stability, tracking the exact moment the old system's internal structures buckle under the weight of the conflict. All the starvation, the rubble, and the grueling analog logistics serve a higher purpose in the eschatological worldview. They are the friction required to tear down an entrenched, top-heavy hierarchy and replace it with a transcendent vision of universal equity. This calculated application of asymmetric chaos acts as a mechanism to force the collapse of the existing order. By exhausting the empire's will and wealth, these urban tactics facilitate a transition toward a system defined by universal justice.